welcome to this chess video everyone. So in this video I want to actually show how we can attack from literally all sides of the board. And so with this idea we're really going to show how you can quite literally dominate your opponent if they're unprepared for this. Okay, so what am I referring to? So here we're going to talk about, there's really three sides of the chessboard you can kind of focus on. So of course you have your queen side, which is generally, from this side here, for white or black. You have your king side, which are, more or less, these three files here. And then you have your center, which are kind of the two more or less in the center. So from here, I'm just going to kind of show two examples here, both from my own games. And so with this technique, this will kind of more start to show itself around kind of the late opening, early middle game in most cases. If you're lucky, you can extend this from the middle game all the way to the end game, but most of the time it's going to kind of start right around the time that the opening phase is ending. Okay, so let's actually get into it and show exactly what I'm referring to here. So we're going to start with d4, they play knight f6, and we're going to have some book moves here for quite a while. So we're just playing normal things here. So of course the king's Indian defense. I play the Zamish variation with f3, and we're, quite right now, quite getting good opening theory. Nothing too out of the ordinary. And so here we have, probably the first inaccuracy of the game, which is pawn to c5. Now, this actually will become important slightly later, but what they should have done is maintain the tension and just like move this knight or something. That would have been an option, just keep the tension in the center. Or if they wanted to get rid of the tension immediately, they could have just traded. And I think both of those would be fine. We would take back the c-pawn, and the game continues. But the reason why c5 is not so great is because it's actually closing up the position. And like I said, this is going to become important slightly later on. So now I play queen d2, very flexible move. They play a6, and now we kind of get to the start of what I'm referring to in this video here. So how we can play on all sides of the board? Well, first of all, the biggest problem to playing on all sides of the board is your king. Because very often, your king wants to castle into a very safe place. And if I'm pushing pawns, like in this case, I've already pushed my c-pawn, I probably don't want to go queenside too often because why would I have pushed the c-pawn? In this case, f3 has been played, it's not the most ideal, but maybe kingside is usually a bit safer in a position like this. Now, the key difference here, why I mentioned about the c6 to c5 move, is because in this case, the position is closed. And when the position closes, especially in the center, now you kind of have this little radar in the back of your mind starting to ping, and you might realize because the center is closed, you can get a little bit more leeway for castling, and you might be able to more likely to actually play on all sides of the board. So this means the queen side, king side, and the center. So here, the center is locked up. That is a huge asset here. If the position was open, there would be no way I could play on every side of the board because my king is going to be way too vulnerable. So if the center is locked up and closed here, like we have in the center, I would say white is a smidge better in the center because they have a space advantage. Now here if we look, we have this little bit thrusting into the enemy territory here. Now keep in mind this, this rank here, the 5th rank, we have a pawn here. So we have a slight space advantage. Our opponent on the other hand, they're only into their 4th rank, right? Because, they're going, towards me. So their 5th rank, they would need like a pawn on d4 to be symmetrical. And, they don't have that, which means that white has a slight space advantage and it's locked up. So that's good. That means that in this case, we have the slightly better center. Now, who has the better queen side or king side? And right now it's about equal. But if we're really ambitious about this, we can actually change that. And so here, my very next move, I want to deter them from playing pawn to b5. And so I play a4 myself. And now it looks a bit more risky for my king if I were to go queenside, because this is really my only pawn that's kind of helping shelter my king for the time being. So right now, kingside looks probably the most appealing as the position is right now. But okay, so now they castle, and now I decide h4. And here's where we're attacking on all sides of the board. If I didn't want to be this aggressive, absolutely, I could have moved this knight out of the way, could have played a move like bishop e2, and then I could have just gotten castled kingside, and I think this would have been a fine way to play. However, here we're going to play very ambitiously, and because the center is closed, and I think I'm slightly better in the center, arguably going to be the same or slightly better on the queen side, so why not play on the king side as well? And if you can take literally all parts of the board, or at least 2 out of the 3 sections, oftentimes you'll be better. So here I play, this h4, and now my opponent actually plays knight to h5, which to be fair is a thematic move. When the king is Indian, they want to be preparing the f5 pawn move. But here it simply walks into pawn to g4. And so now they don't really want to go back, because if they go back, I just play h5, and I'm already starting to rip open, their position on their king. So here they actually opted for knight to f4, which I trade here, and then that simply gives me a pawn. And so already we've kind of got a slight opening advantage because of our aggressive play right from the beginning. They play knight to e5. Of course, I don't want to fall for this knight fork here, and so I just develop with bishop e2. They do the same with rook to e8, and now this is 15 moves in, and now we can kind of take stock of, who's winning on what flank. So we've made slight progress here. We are still slightly better in the center because it's closed, no one can advance, and we have a slight space advantage, so that's good. On the queen side here, it's more or less equal. We have deterred them from playing b5, which is good, and so maybe we can actually keep the position closed, perhaps, on that side of the board. But we'll have to see as the game progresses. Now, here on the king side, this is where we've made the most progress, because now we've advanced these pawns and gained even more space. And so if they're not careful, we're threatened to A, cramp the opponent by gaining even more space on that flank, or B, start ripping open lines, playing a move like h5 and really going after their king. And all of this is possible because we were aggressively playing on literally all parts of the board. And so if you can do this, this is something that most people are quite simply not prepared to face. They just don't face that kind of aggression that often. And although the king looks exposed in the center, it is fairly safe because the center is closed. And later in this game, I actually did get castled queenside, and I was actually safe enough that I won the game. Now, both sides, after the rest of these moves here, we played a lot of mistakes from both sides, so it was by no means a flawless game. But at least for the time being, we'll go to the next example, and we'll kind of show what it looks like when we don't advance so many pawns, because you can actually attack on other sides of the board, not just pushing pawns. Okay, so here we'll have a different example, and so in this game I was also white. So I play d4, they play d5. This time we get a different setup, where I play c4, we get a queen's gambit declined with e6, and now after knight c3, they play pawn to f5, which is a whole different type of structure, more outside the scope of this video. It's kind of like some kind of Stonewall Dutch is kind of what they're going for. But just to be simple without explaining all the details of it, control is going to be over the e5 square, where I'm really going to try and reinforce this square, probably get my knight in there, perhaps get other pieces near e5, and really clamp down on this square. So my next move is in line with that. I play bishop to f4, again, putting more pressure on this square. And so the game continues, knight f6, we're still in the opening, still developing moves. I play e3 to try and get my light scored bishop out. They play bishop to b4, I develop, they castle, I castle, sounds good so far. They decided they didn't want to trade their bishop here and give up the bishop here, so they just dropped their bishop back. Now I play knight e5, going in what I was trying for. They play queen e8, a very flexible move, very common in the Dutch defense, where it might come out to h5 in some lines, and actually maybe start possibly even attacking my king. Just depends. And now I play c5, and this is kind of the start of my aggressive idea, because very similar before, where we had the a4 and h4, now we're playing c5, and the whole idea is I want to keep the center in this position closed. Now, it would have been fine if I had just stayed here and, played positional in the sense that I could possibly trade here at some point, maintain the tension in the center, and I could have just developed and played a normal game. But I want the center closed in a lot of these lines if I want to play on all sides of the board, even though my king is castled. So I didn't have to close the center, but in this case I actually wanted to, because I thought I actually have a little bit better advantage in the center, I thought. Now, after c5, very similar to the last thing we saw, first example, I have a slight space advantage now. I have these pawns pointing this way, and this pawn is actually in their territory. And so that's a nice advantage. This pawn, however, is still in their own territory. So I have a smidge of a space advantage in the center, and this knight is doing a really good job at controlling a lot of key squares, in their side of the board. So this is also something I really liked as well. So if I'm better in the center, and I'm possibly planning to expand on the queen side with these moves, then I might actually be better on the queen side. And as long as I'm better on 2 out of the 3, sides at least, then usually this is enough to justify trying this. And if they're not careful, then maybe I could play on the king side, but I generally don't want to be playing like that here with these pawns, like the first example, because my king is castled here. So generally I want to keep these 3 pawns very close to my king, but I definitely want to be playing on the king side, playing on the queen side and the center, and not on the king side. So okay, so now they develop with knight b to d7. I follow through with my plan, trying to secure even more space with b4. They don't want me to keep that space, and I could have played pawn to a3. That was a candidate move of mine, but I evaluated that as maybe a smidge better for me, and I thought I had more ambitious, which was to just simply advance my pawn. So I play pawn to b5, trying to gain even more space. And so they trade in the center, I capture back, they try and exchange off my bishop, and generally speaking, when you have more space, you want to cramp the opponent. And one thing that they can do to try and alleviate the pressure is to try and trade pieces off. But if you're the one with the space advantage, you do not want to trade pieces because you want to keep them cramped. And if they have a bunch of pieces, they're kind of getting in their own way. It makes it, more of a squeeze for them. So they would much rather trade pieces. So here, I really don't want to trade pieces. I'm going to try and preserve my bishop. And so the top engine move was bishop to c7, which is a clever move to advance into their territory. But I played the second best move, which is bishop to g3, and I just preserved the bishop. Now, I think my opponent actually understood that I was trying to play on all sides of the board here, and they realized that I'm better in the center, and I'm better on the queen side, especially with this, nicely advanced pawn. And so if I'm better on those two flanks, I think they understood that really the only chance they have is on the king side. And g5 is a creative move the computer doesn't really love, but according to the engine, it's actually the second best move. Best was apparently e5 instead, to try and strike in the center. But g5 was the second best, so I can't really fault them, and they're playing on the side of the board that they thought they should have been playing on. So I try and trade here on c6, they take back, and now from here, this is already 15 moves in, and so we'll, more or less stop the position here and kind of take stock of who's winning on what side. So again, in the center, I'm slightly better. It's not as close as it was, but I have a smidge of a space advantage because of this advanced pawn. Now on the queen side here, I think I'm slightly better. And my very next move is actually rook to b1 and trying to contest the open file. Now note that they couldn't actually play this to begin with because I had my bishop attacking the rook on b8. So it's actually very difficult for this rook to find an active place in the game. So I thought I was better on this, the queen side and center. On the king side, however, my opponent is definitely better, I think. This bishop is very close to getting trapped. Maybe something like f4, possibly h5 or h4, depending on the position. In this case, I decided to trade on c6 because I realized my bishop is not getting trapped yet. So as long as I'm aware of this, I should be okay. Now the reason it's not getting trapped is because if they ever try and advance this pawn here, I can just take, and when they take back, I have this in-between move. I can play this queen g4 check, hitting their king, and adding one more attacker to the f4 square, and then their rook isn't really enough, and my bishop is not trapped. So that was kind of the tactical resource behind that. But as long as my bishop does not get trapped here, and maybe I'd play h3 at some point. In the game, I actually didn't see a need for it, and I don't think I ever ended up playing that move. But the point is, I'm playing in the center, and I'm playing on the queen side. And even though my opponent is correctly playing on the king side, I have 2 of the 3 parts of the board controlled. And if you're more aware of trying to play on literally all parts of the board, it's just something that most players are not equipped to deal with. It's very difficult to try and attack literally everywhere, but it's even more difficult to try and defend everywhere. And so this is just something that I see a lot of very strong players do, and as a result, I've tried to adopt it into my own play. So going back to the first example real briefly, the center being closed, I think, is a really big asset that happens here. And almost always you're going to have a smidge of a space advantage, usually in the center, which kind of is, for me, one of the visual cues that if the center is closed and I have a smidge of an advantage there, maybe I can get a little bit more greedy or a little bit more ambitious and actually try and start gaining a space on the other sides of the board, the queen side and the king side. And if I can do that, I can just start running them over in space and maybe even attacking with my pieces later down the road. Now you can also do the same pattern. So thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.